Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I know it's very difficult being here on a Sunday morning, and for most Karachiites, a winter morning, which really isn't in winter. But thank you for being here today. So guys, what you see here on screen is actually from some of our notes from 2015, when we had just started to immerse ourselves in this world that we hardly knew of, what most of us over here call the world of entrepreneurship. Honestly, we never use that term in our conversations or even in our thoughts, really. It was a very new term. And for us, what was really at the core of everything was this purpose that we were euphoric about. I think even now, so I really hope, that euphoria remains, but it was this purpose that we were euphoric of. And, when we actually think about it, I don't know whether that purpose really just lit in our minds, it just got awakened, or it was, a series of life events through which, that kept started brewing and just maybe, it brought us to that purpose. Now, whatever it was that purpose, that made us start what we started and helped us remain true to this journey, which now actually seems like a very, very long journey that went by very fast. I think a lot of you entrepreneurs over here who started something would relate to me. Now, Hamza, my co-founder in all my startups, and I, we started these companies, our first venture, not sitting in some fancy office space. Back in 2011, both of us, we were working at the Pakistan Credit Rating Agency, PACRA. We were buried under rating reports. And both of us, we were actually specialists for the microfinance sector. Now, PACRA actually exposed us to both the strength and the fragility of the financial ecosystem. While we were studying the sector, we were fortunate enough to have met with, the boards and the managements of the microfinance institutions and the banks. But I think one thing that I find myself being very fortunate to have done was to have been a part of the SMART campaign, which was actually an initiative of the Center for Financial Inclusion that worked for client protection. And it was during that time, that we got to conduct these field visits and meet with borrowers in far-flung areas. In far-flung areas, and really understand how, they operated and what it meant, what finance or money actually meant to them. These were actually people who were living on the edge. One illness away from poverty, one bad week away from hunger. So it was actually these field visits that changed us. Now, we saw up close how financial systems or ecosystems can either include people or completely exclude them. We understood that access to finance is not just about money. It's about dignity, it's about opportunity, and for many, it's about survival. That realization actually stayed with us. Now, one of the criticisms that the microfinance sector has faced for the longest time is that the sector charges very high interest rates. Now, for most of you who don't understand this, see, microfinance actually serves the base of the pyramid in far-flung areas. They actually go into the field. Their processes are human-intensive, they're time-intensive, they're operationally heavy. And so, in order to reach a customer, they have to spend a lot of money to actually, go on and give out a loan, for example, versus a bank, which actually doesn't serve the base of the pyramid. For them, they're either serving the government or corporates or high net worth individuals. And, for them, these are lower risk customers, as a result of which there's a big gap in the rates that are usually charged. But not, that criticism, actually, not a lot of people really try to understand why, where that's brewing from. So, we actually tried to understand how could, we help these microfinance institutions and banks lower these operational costs so that that benefit could be passed on to the customers in the form of lower interest rates. So, we thought to ourselves, how do we bring these costs down? And for that, we really dwelled very deep. But as analysts, we could only observe the system. We couldn't fix it. So, as confused, some 20-year-olds, very, very hungry for purpose, we wrote down these, to-dos during one of our sessions that Hamza and I used to have, very often. And that list became Check-in Solutions, the first company that we started that we don't usually talk much about, but it really founded the basis of our entrepreneurial journey. Now, at Check-in, we actually aim to digitize the entire credit disbursement process for microfinance institutions and banks, and lower operational costs, reduce turnaround time, and ultimately lower the interest rates that were charged to the end consumers. Now, little did we realize that we weren't actually just building a technology. We were actually thinking of disrupting a sector that had been laced with legacy systems and mindsets since decades. The funny thing was we had no experience. We had no roadmap. It was just this purpose and this naive optimism that purpose would probably be enough. So that purpose was actually for us to democratize financial inclusion and to make access to financial services as easy as access to a mobile phone. So we decided that, we should get some hands-on experience in understanding how microfinance operates and how startups are built. So Hamza went on to join a microfinance institution, and I went on to join this e-commerce startup in Lahore to get that experience. And both of us during our days, we were working on our day jobs. At nights, we were working on check-in. On the weekends, we were working on check-in. And this actually went on for a year, and we realized, oh my God, if we are really to do this, we really have to put our entire focus into it. So I don't know whether it was a courageous move or it was naive on our part, but we decided to take the plunge. And we decided to leave our jobs to start focusing on check-in completely. And, that's when the real birth of check-in actually happened. So we actually bootstrapped everything. We were hearing some of the panelists earlier. Bootstrapping was the way for us. Even from office space, to the resources that we actually had for building a prototype, we just bootstrapped our way. Interestingly, we also organized a fun fair. Yes, really a fun fair to raise money to, build our prototype. Now we look back and we laugh at it. But, we ate whatever was cheap. We weren't paying ourselves anything for 2 years. We even found partners in Bulgaria and India. Now that I think about it, it was probably like suicide at the time, but things were a little better with India at the time. So we tried to look for partners then. And I think it was very brave, and honestly, it was insane. But I think what was core at the heart of whatever we were doing was that purpose that kept us anchored. But I think the main thing that kept us going was that belief. We met with every microfinance institution and bank, and actually I've got Kabir over here today. One of the first MFBs that we actually met was Kabir, and he was, a great supporter. He really, really helped us with that journey. So thank you, Kabir, for that. And now, we also met with another microfinance bank, full circle. We're trying to work with them as well. But whenever we met with these guys, everyone loved the idea. Or at least that's how we perceived, it was. I don't know whether we were in denial, but, that's how it went early on. And it was at that point, that we got in touch with who became our third co-founder, Mr. Nadeem Hussain. We presented him the idea. He really liked it. He introduced us to the entire microfinance sector. And, I always recall him telling us, we will be partners one day. So, that was actually serendipitous when that happened. But however, I think one thing we weren't prepared for, didn't realize, was that back in 2015, the SACP had actually introduced a new set of framework to regulate the microfinance institutions. Now, all of us over here today talk about the NBFC regulations. Those were the regulations, the notorious or the famous regulations that came out then that transformed the entire sector. And so all these MFIs were very, very busy transforming. So everyone went completely inward. They had no, headspace or budgets for technology. They had no room for innovation. And so, we were not only fighting timing, we were fighting regulations. We were fighting sector fatigue. And I think to some extent, we were also fighting our families' concerns. Why don't you, work for a more stable organization? Why are you risking everything? Is this worth it? And honestly, at one point, we also, asked ourselves those questions. But, purpose doesn't go away when others doubt you. It actually becomes louder. And that's what happened for us. So when the Katalyst FinTech Disrupt Challenge happened, by the way, that's us on the screen. And as you see Hamza making that face, it's the toughest challenge for me was always to get him to take a decent picture. He's probably going to kill me when he sees this. But we actually applied for the first Katalyst FinTech Disrupt Challenge in 2016. We entered with all that we had. And we became one of the finalists, the top 5 finalists at the time, but we didn't win. And we were, we were heartbroken. But now, in retrospect, when we see, it actually was destined to be. That's actually what made us think that if institutions weren't ready to digitize microfinance, maybe we had to become that institution to show it to them. And, that's when we actually reached back to Nadeem Saab. I remember him saying that, maybe it's time that we show them how it's done. That was like, a light being lit, because our visions really aligned at the point. And that was the birth of Tezz. Tezz actually became the first financial institution of fintech in Pakistan to get a lending license back in 2018. We started off in 2017. And the purpose for us for Tezz was to create a full-stack neobank, just serving the masses completely through a smartphone app. As you see this on screen, this is actually from our first pitch deck of Tezz back in 2017. I was presenting this in Zurich. And now I'm thinking, we were either very ambitious or too naive. We wanted to do everything. It was credit, savings, insurance, investments, everything. But I think we realized that if we were really to focus, credit itself was such a big animal. So we actually had to pivot and really focus on that one vertical. And so we actually gave out nano loans back in 2018 to people who never had a credit history. They had no collateral. People who had never been banked. Now we have so many of them come in, and I'm glad to have known that we were one of the first to have done it. But it was, it was actually, now that I think about it, I think it took a lot of heart, it took a lot of strength, and it took a lot of, I think, lots of money of the investors as well. We were, very lucky to have raised funding from the Umidar Network, which is now Flourish Ventures, Axion, which is the largest microfinance funder in the world, and Planet N. And, that actually helped us scale to 160 cities in Pakistan. We had no playbook. There were no set regulations then. Funding was uncertain. But, what we did was that we were very, very structured in how we were trying to approach just one single purpose and problem. Tezz was fortunate enough to have won a lot of recognition awards globally and in Pakistan. Recently, we became a case study at LUMS in terms of how purpose-led businesses are built. It's serendipitous that I'm talking about it today. But, behind every milestone that we achieved, there were months and months of grit, at times doubt, and a lot of failures and rebuilding. There were hundreds of investor rejections, like for a lot of us. There were nights when doubt felt heavier than, belief. But entrepreneurship didn't break us, it built us. In 2022, actually, Tezz got acquired by Zood. And Zood was, that actually seemed like something that we actually hadn't planned this exit. It was the first fintech M&A exit in Pakistan. And honestly, when I talk about it, a lot of the entrepreneurs today see exit as a purpose. Exit was actually never on the cards for us when we were actually building. But I think what it validated was that companies and purpose-led companies from emerging markets can create global value. And so, at Zood, I was actually able to head some of the global projects. We were working with Uzbekistan, Jordan, Lebanon, Azerbaijan. And so, yeah, it was quite an experience for me. Now fast forward. I think I'm a little over time. If I can have 2-3 more minutes. Thank you. Now I'm actually building on my next venture. It's actually, I'm working on building something for SME and retailer financing. But again, the purpose remains the same. And that purpose is to build a more financially exclusive tomorrow. Now, I think in the best interest of time, I'll try to skim through this. But there were a few key takeaways, that I would like to impart with you guys. Maybe it makes sense for some, maybe not for others. Your purpose is actually your only unfair advantage. Markets will shift, funding will dry down, regulations will change, people will doubt you. But your only true compass will be that purpose. It will always anchor you. Purpose actually sustains when motivation fades. The second, take the step before you feel ready. A lot of us actually want to build the perfect model, the perfect prototype, and then go to the market. Don't worry about it. Start messy, lean loud, grow continuously. You do not have to be afraid to fail. Just like Winston Churchill once said, success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. Now, again, I think this is what most of us know. Consistency beats brilliance. Everyone is inspired on day one. Purpose actually is tested on day 1,000. Now, this is something that most of us would understand. Pivoting is not abandoning your purpose. It's actually protecting it. So entrepreneurship is not about being right the first time. It's about being honest enough to accept what did not work and being brave enough to change direction before the world forces you to change it. I think this is something that a lot of us usually undermine. The world, I think one thing that's important is that relationships are your real capital. You cannot build anything in isolation. So make sure that you surround yourself with the people, the mentors, the allies, the partners who actually will walk that path with you. And I think the most important thing is your life is multidimensional. Don't think about work in isolation because you have to look into your family, your friends. And I think for me, one of the biggest, guilt has been actually moving cities when we started Tezz. And the guilt because, I have a brother who, I'm sharing something personal, who has Down syndrome. And we are very close. So that time for me, being away from him was that guilt, was a conscious decision that I took. And I think a lot of us have made those sacrifices in some way or the other. But I think when you actually think about that purpose that has remained for you, that's what actually keeps you get out of it. So I would actually like to close on a note that whatever you do, make sure that you have that purpose as your anchor always. Because your journey is never going to be linear. It's certainly not going to be predictable. But just be courageous, be consistent, and just have this belief that no matter what you're doing, you're actually trying to build something that is larger than yourself. So thank you so much, guys.